Hello and welcome to Sean White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. On the floor of the NABCEP conference in Reno, we have myself, Sean White, and Bill Brooks interviewing the legend Ward Bauer. Ward Bauer pretty much invented the solar industry and the grid tie inverter.
Coming to you from the Suncast media stage at NABCEP, the NABCEP Conference 2025. And so I'm sitting here with my friends Ward and Bill, and what this is all about today is we're going to talk to Ward, because I think that it's very important to help out those people that are not born yet, that are going to be born in 1,000 years, to let them know about what's going on in the solar industry and what happened, the history of the solar industry. And so one of my favorite people, my solar superhero, is Ward Bauer. And he's sort of has a Forrest Gump story, like, you know how Forrest Gump, he won ping pong tournaments in China, he ran around, and he just like saw all these different things, and he was there for all these meeting presidents and stuff. And so Ward's been in the solar industry for quite a while. And I asked Bill to help me interview Ward today too, because Bill and Ward are good friends. And I got lucky enough too to sit on a NABCEP committee with Ward Bauer, and I got to know him that way. And I know that Bill has sat on a lot more committees than I have. And so thanks a lot, Ward, for talking to us today.
Okay, no problem. I'm going to enjoy it, in fact. The PV industry has come a long, long ways. It hasn't been a friendly trip to begin with. Talk about utilities not liking people or systems. We were at the bottom of the list. PV was something they had no interest in. They really did whatever they could do to discourage PV coming onto their grid. It was there, okay? And in fact, I'm going to jump into a story on the code-making panel that includes photovoltaic systems. And my very first experience, I was there with Bob Nicholson, who was with Glass Tech at that time. And we walked in there wet behind the ears with some really good proposals for the next code cycle. And one of those proposals was, hey, for low voltage systems, we can do them ungrounded. Whoa, that really blew gaskets on the other side of the fence. They basically said, we've been doing these things grounded for 200 years, almost, whatever that was. Okay, and yes, but we were talking about ungrounding systems for light poles, or you had a single light battery and a PV system to light maybe a parking lot or a pathway or things like that. But we really stirred the water by talking ungrounded systems. They did not like us. They told us to go home and do our homework. Exact words, okay? So it was not a friendly time. But the photovoltaic system, I was just in a panel meeting that had to do with power conditioning systems. Whoa. The utilities are thinking, hey, we need that. That's the way to go. What a big change from almost 30 years ago. Any comments, Bill?
Well, yeah, power control systems is definitely an area that's changing the world in a lot of different ways and has a lot of people's attention, including utilities. And it's things that we were having to develop because we're running into limitations on how we could do things. And so we've been able to successfully change the way electricity is used in PV, and a lot of it goes way back, in PV starting a lot of the changes, paradigm shifts, and back to your early days on the code panel, and even before. Article 690 started in the code in the 1984 code cycle and was written by you were involved, Ward, and I know Tom Key and Ray Dukes from, what's his first name?
From UL.
From UL.
Yeah.
And
Paul Dukes.
Paul Dukes, that's right.
That's a great name.
And Dave Menicucci was involved from Sandia National Labs. So that was written in 1981. So that's a long time ago.
It was, yeah.
So Ward, you're kind of like my grandfather, who passed away probably 20 years ago. He rode horse carts in the early 1900s, drive cars, fly airplanes, and watch people land on the moon in his lifetime. Mm-hmm. So from your perspective, you've been able to see kind of the whole gambit like he saw in transportation. You've seen it in solar. So what's a little bit of your perspective on that whole range of time over the last, say, 40, 50 years.
Right. Well, technologies have really advanced. The modules themselves were 6-volt modules, quite a few amps in some cases, sometimes fairly large wires that weren't 20-year modules. Some of them had basically rubberized coatings on them. It wasn't glass. There were different kinds of coatings, different kinds of technologies to interconnect the cells behind the glass or the silicon. So there's been a monster change in the modules themselves to where they can mass produce gigawatts worth in a month's time. It's amazing. So that's a monster change. There's a change in the electronics that's either going to convert whatever comes out of the modules to something in a DC fashion, to charge batteries in the early days, but today to be connected or interconnected with the utility grid, or to even supply standalone loads. The early inverters were basically what was called line commutated. Now we have self-commutated inverters. I think the big change is the control technologies. Early on, the control technologies couldn't even keep up with the changes that took place on the grid when little glitches came along. I think one thing that you can remember, all of those inverters, you could hear them. They were switching at audio frequencies. Today, they're well above audio frequencies, and the components get smaller. The filtering is less complicated. There's so many things that can come along. And then the integrated circuits to do the job that used to take maybe hundreds of transistors, resistors, capacitors, and so forth. So there's been a monster change in the inverter technology. I think we should not talk about the interconnection and the role of the National Electrical Code, the role of Underwriters Laboratories and other certification laboratories, bringing experts together to put things together that made safety safe and safety sense. Safety has become a big part of today's projects.
We interrupt you for a very important announcement. Shaun White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast has been brought to you by Shaun White's Solar and Energy Storage Podcast. That's right, Shaun White is sponsoring his own podcast, and he wants to remind you to go check out some of his classes. You can go to SolarSean, that's Solar, SEAN.com, and then click on the links to check out his classes. You can check out his heat spring classes, and you can also hire him to teach classes for you, like at your company, something like that. Now back to the show.
I think you were involved with getting the inverter standards so that we could comfortably connect them to the grid with the utility approving of it. What was that like?
Well, again, UL had a lot to do with it, and if we didn't have UL at our back, the people on the code making panel would have just basically raised their eyebrows, because we have people like Tim, others that were convincing the code making panel experts that these things were being tested in many, many ways. And the environmental testing that's taken place, that's part of UL standards. The interconnection standards are just making people feel more comfortable. And along with that, there's a lot of IEEE standards that have come along that aren't basically the installation standards, but the standards used to produce products and invent products.
Yeah, we started out with IEEE 929. That was the first standard, and that actually started in the 1980s.
Yes, yeah.
And nobody could come to a conclusion, and probably rightly so. The utilities really didn't want it to happen anyway.
Yeah.
And so it kind of got shelved for quite a few years. And so IEEE 929 took ultimately probably 12, 14 years before it was first ratified in the late 1990s, but it did become the basis for IEEE 1547, which is the standard we use today for utility interconnection. And so that long history, and you were obviously involved in the very earliest of 929, and I was involved in the second phase of 929 in a big way, and now it's kind of almost considered second nature. Well, it's gotten very, very complicated with grid support functionalities and all the things that go into, and you're big involved in the microgrid world, so tell us a little bit about that for the last 10 or 15 years.
Okay, the last 10 or 15 years is for the microgrid world. I don't know if anybody's kept track of how photovoltaics has grown. I remember it was a curve that was kind of along the baseline, and then pretty soon it started taking off, and pretty soon it was exponential. We can't even keep up with it these days. But the microgrid is in the same boat that photovoltaics was in the early stages. You know, that one or two in the last year or so. I think California has already installed over 1,000 microgrids, maybe more at this point in time. It's going so fast. So microgrids are a way to basically distribute the loads along distribution lines on the utility. It's a way to even get humidity system put together, and it's a fantastic way to go. It's on a high growth curve at this point in time.
So here we are at the NABCEP conference, and speaking of those Forrest Gump-like events, you were there when they invented NABCEP. And I remember you telling me a story one time where you were down in Mexico heading for the beach. You got a phone call, and it's like, come here, start this NABCEP thing.
Yeah.
So, and I think you've probably been on the board the whole time, right?
Before it was a board, I was there, yes.
Even before it was a board, it was like a piece of paper then, or was it?
Well, they destroyed a beautiful beach party.
Dang.
They sent me a ticket to go to Baltimore to an IEEE conference.
Oh, man.
I got there just
I
in
think
time.
that's time to send you the beach.
Oh, yes, there you go. Anyway, I got there, and it was obvious that the PV industry was in distress. A lot of systems were being installed, and just as many systems were not working. So I went around conference room like we have here at NABCEP. I talked to the manufacturers. 20 of them showed up at an unpublished meeting, and we decided we need to do something to get these installers certified, and also to do some things to get the equipment better certified.
How long have you been in solar for?
Since 1977.
77. And then Bill, how about you?
1988, so I'm a relative newcomer.
But he was a heck of a tennis player.
Yeah.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, well, I still think Ward has the title for the longest running, continuously operating in the solar industry person, in the PV industry, that I can think of. We have Don Warfield here, who started in 1978. And I know that Miles Russell, who works with Yaskawa, was around 1977, 1978, right around the same time. Ed Kern. And so there's a handful of people that are from the late 70s that are still in the business, and it's not more than 10 that I can think of.
Probably not.
Yeah.
70s and the solar. Did you have like direct solar disco balls, or what was going on back then?
You're right.
I don't think the people that were working in it were involved with disco balls. That would have been a distraction that they didn't have time for.
I still think it's a good idea.
Yeah, solar powered disco balls. I did get involved with powering the man at Burning Man, so that's kind of different than a disco ball, but similar maybe.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Just don't burn it. So, yeah, and one more thing is, like, I was just having lunch with Ward, and I was asking if there was such thing as a inverter with rotating equipment in it, you know, DC to AC, and what was it called?
Well, it was something built by Northern Power Systems. They were in the windmill system, and they were trying to figure out how to get wind turbines better on the grid. So they basically took some of their mechanical equipment and converted it into basically an inverter that could do the job.
That's so cool.
Yeah.
All right, that might even give us a little bit of inertia, and we're just going to finish it off with that. So we want to thank the Suncast Media Stage, NABCEP 2025, and Bill Brooks and Ward Bauer. I'm surrounded by the greats.
One more thing. This podcast has been released on what I'm calling Herman Scher Day. Herman Scher, like Ward Bauer, was instrumental in starting the modern solar industry. He started what is called the feed-in tariff in Germany. The feed-in tariff pretty much primed the pump for manufacturing solar products. They made it so that installing a grid-connected solar system would actually give someone a profit. This feed-in tariff required utilities to reimburse someone with a grid-connected PV system a price that would give them a good return on investment, which at the time was much more than people were paying for electricity, perhaps 10 times more. But this got the modern solar industry rolling. The feed-in tariff took off throughout Europe, Also, Ontario, Canada, it really increased manufacturing. Then you have economies of scale, and now you have solar energy produced from PV being the least expensive type of electricity that there is. That's why more solar is going up and less coal plants are being installed. Thanks, Herman Scher, and thanks, Ward Bauer. 1 year ago today, we released a podcast with Ike Weber. So go back to April 29th, 2024, and check out Ike. Ike used to run the big lab in Germany, which is sort of like NREL for Germany. He's a friend of mine. We've gone sailing together, and he was a friend of Herman Scher. Check it out. Stay tuned for next year when we celebrate Herman Scher Day on April 29th. Today, Herman Scher would have been 81 years old. However, he passed away in 2010. Happy birthday! Woo!